Welcome to a special edition of Developer Preview Live. My name is Zayne Turner, and I'm happy to be hosting you with this very particular edition where we're focusing on everything Lightning Web Components. But before we dive in, we want to remind you that Salesforce is a publicly traded company, and any purchasing decisions that you make should be based on our currently available, completely awesome technology. So, in case you missed it, we have a few big announcements that we're sharing with you, and we want you to be asking your questions as we're sharing. So on Twitter, tweet at Salesforce Devs using the hashtags Salesforce Live, and of course, including your code goals. And we'll get your questions answered by our panel of experts. Earlier this week, we had a major launch event announcing Lightning Web Components, which is a new programming model built on modern web standards. And it's coming GA in spring 19, and that's what we're talking about today. But what are Lightning Web Components? Well, they're modern UI experiences, as you can see right here on the slide, but that really means that it's built in a whole new way. We're talking modern web standards, whether that's how you're writing your JavaScript, which we're going to look at, or what kind of performance you're getting, faster performance, more native code running in the browser, and we're also going to look at that. And it works with the code you already have. Those are the Aura components that you're used to writing today, and we're also going to look at that. And to take you through what this means to work with Aura really quickly, there are different ways that you can compose these components on a page. You could put our new Lightning Web Components inside an Aura component. You can put them side by side and have them communicate through events or their public APIs. And of course, you can also have them talking to things like Lightning Data Service and those specialized services that you're used to using. But it's one thing to see this all in slides, and it's another thing to actually see what this means for you, the developers building in spring. And to do this, we have an awesome panel of experts joining me here in the studio. And panel, why don't you tell us who you are?
Thanks, Zane. I'm Kevin Venkateshwaran. I'm a software architect and Lightning platform, and I work on Lightning Web Components along with things like Lightning Data Service that you mentioned.
And I'm Kevin Hill, and I'm a product manager for UI frameworks at Salesforce, which includes both Aura components and Lightning Web Components that we're going to talk about today.
I'm Dave Carroll, and I'm a product manager on the Salesforce DX team, primarily responsible for our dev tools, which includes Visual Studio Code and the CLI.
Awesome. So I think we should just dive right in. And Kevin, can you show us what it means to build with Lightning Web Components?
Absolutely. Thank you, Zane. So what I'm going to do is walk us through one of our applications, the Lightning Web Components recipes. Now, this is a sample that's available online today. You can go and see details on it from our Trailhead. But I'm going to show us a handful of recipes, sort of small code snippets that demonstrate key functionality. I'm going to start with the simple component in the bottom left corner here called Hello Binding. And what this demonstrates is the ability for Lightning Web Components to accept some input and basically automatically bind that data back into the UI. So as we go ahead and change this message, for example, to say, Hello Zane, we can see update on the screen immediately. Let's take a look at this recipe and what the code is behind it. We'll start first with the HTML. You'll see a handful of things that are probably familiar to you as an HTML developer. We have the standard template tag. We also have some additional components which we'll speak about in a moment, and you'll also see things like these SLDS classes. That's the Salesforce Lightning Design System. Those are standard styling techniques to make your components look like Salesforce. Beyond that, you'll see some slightly new things like these braces. And we'll step into that in a brief moment, but what that is in short is an ability to bind to some logic. So we have our greeting here as well as an input component. Let's take a look at the other part of this Lightning Web Component, which is the JavaScript. Now, this is probably new to some of you, but what we see here is modern JavaScript. Starting on line 1, we have an import statement. That's a standard part of ES6, and that allows us to pull in components and logic from other modules. We then have a default class here that we export, and that is the basis of our Lightning Web Component. It is a JavaScript class. Proceeding down here, we've got that greeting. So as you initially saw, we were displaying something like Hello World. As the user goes and inputs it, our event handler, handle change, is fired, and then we're able to change that variable. This .greeting we reassign to what I typed in. In that last case was Zane. So what that does is it assigns the variable into this .greeting, and that causes the Lightning Web Components engine to go and re-render that component. So quite straightforward, just a little bit of code, and you saw something quite interactive on the screen. Let's take a look at another recipe, which connects us to Apex. So Apex, of course, very common that you'd want to use business logic and fetch data, for example. And we're going to dig into this Apex wire method to property. So here we have a list of contacts that we've pulled. Let's take a look again at this recipe's implementation. So stepping into the code again, we'll start this time with the JavaScript. Again, things very familiar that we just saw. The import statement's a class, but we have something new here. We have this import statement that references the Salesforce Apex. And what that's doing is it's actually referencing an Apex method and an Apex class that we've implemented. We then use it to wire in that Apex class into this property. With that, with those 3 lines of code, or 4 lines of code there that we've got, that basically connects our Lightning Web Component to the underlying Apex method and its logic. We get that data provided to us automatically. Now let's take a look at the HTML of this web component that demonstrates how to use that. As we step into the HTML, again, we're going to see very similar things, the standard template tag and so forth. But we do see a few new things. One that'll draw your attention to is this if statement. So this allows us to express logic in our template to conditionally display something. If that condition is true, we then proceed to display what's below it. The other item which I'll reference here is this for each. This allows us to do iterations. So in this particular case, we were loading some context from our Apex method. If we receive that data, we then iterate through each one of them, and for each one, we then use that binding syntax again to display the name. Quite straightforward, just a few lines of code, and all of a sudden we've created a component that loads live data out of our org. Now let's go ahead and look at another component. This one's quite a bit more rich, and yet you'll see it's quite easy to create. What we're going to do is navigate over here to display the details of contact. And I'll draw your attention here to the bottom right corner, this component. And what you see here is we've created a form. And right now this form is in read mode, but we can go ahead and edit it at any point. And what's really quite interesting about this is that based off the metadata, it determines how to display these fields. So the salutation, for example, is a pick list. We can choose an item here. We can go ahead and change a name and so forth. But beyond that, it also has validation logic. So if I was to enter an invalid email address, for example, just Kevin, and I try and save it, I get that feedback immediately as a user. That's great. So if I go ahead and fill in the correct email address, I hit save, it then goes ahead and takes care of saving that. Quite easy and quite straightforward to use. Let's take a look at the details of this recipe. So again, let's take a look at the JavaScript of this component. Again, standard import statement, and this time we've got another component. 2 things I'll draw your attention to are these @APIs and these 2 variables we've imported. So this @API, which is an emerging standard in JavaScript called decorators, allows us to receive effectively context from the Flexi page or the Lightning page that it's hosted on. So in the case where we saw in the UI, we were loading in the details of a contact record. Here we're actually going to receive then the record ID of that contact record, as well as the object name, contact. We then have an array of just strings here, which we're going to go use in a moment in our in our template to determine which fields to display. So as you recall in that field, or on that form, we're displaying the name, title, and these other fields. So let's take a look at the HTML of this web component. Stepping here, again, standard HTML. This time I'll draw your attention to the Lightning record form. So with this single tag, what we've done is created, as you can see here, a form which not only displayed, but supported edit of that data. And it did so in a metadata-aware way, where we didn't have to do any of the complexity. This tag takes care of all of it. It's literally one line to display that entire form, make it editable, apply those rules around validation, and actually take care of saving it back to our org. It's pretty incredible that we can do something so simply with just a few lines of code.
If I may, we used to have something similar still do in Visualforce, which was record detail. But it was so much less flexible. You couldn't necessarily control which fields, with the exception of your standard layouts or layouts plus record types. And this just gives you that same kind of quick functionality, but way more flexible. I think it's awesome.
Thanks, Dave. I'd like to show us one other component in this demo, and that is to demonstrate the capability of the interoperability between Aura and Lightning Web Components. So what you see on screen here are 3 components at the bottom here. And you'll note that 2 of them at the bottom are tied with that Aura component. This is indicating to us that we actually implemented this in Aura, our traditional programming model. And so I can go ahead and, for example, start to search for a name. And what it does is it then communicates with our Lightning Web Component on the same page in real time as we type. And what we're doing is we're loading then a list of contacts. And similarly to Aura communicating to Lightning Web Components, I can click on any one of these and see the detail, and that shows the Lightning Web Component communicating to an Aura component as well and driving it. And here we see the details of the contact. So all the existing investment that you have in Aura and in Apex and so forth is fully interoperable with Lightning Web Components.
That's awesome.
Thank you. The one other thing I'd like to quickly draw our attention to is we've placed all of these components onto Lightning pages. So let's take a quick look at how we do that. On that last form, in fact, what I added to that component was this XML file. And this XML file that you may be familiar with that we use on our other types of metadata defines basically some additional information about that component. Two things to draw our eyes to. The first off is this targets. It tells our system which Lightning pages are you able to add this page to in Lightning App Builder. Secondly, we provide some additional configuration to that. Specifically, in this case, we're going to limit our form to just the contact object. But just with these few items, we're able to indicate this component should be accessible in the palette of Lightning App Builder, and then as an administrator or as a user, you can drag and drop that into your page and customize it.
That's awesome. So can I still do things like if I'm used to developing in the world of Aura, which are those Lightning component bundles that developers today are making, can I still have things like design attributes?
Absolutely. So inside of this target config, you can also specify which properties you'd like to expose into the property editor of Lightning App Builder. So your users can also do additional configuration that way.
Awesome. And is there a recipe for that?
There absolutely is.
Great. And we'll show you how you can get the code yourself. All of these recipes are available for you online, so you can explore this code even more. So Kevin, you say that this is interoperable with Aura. I said it, you said it. We saw one of those recipes. But what's the real story? Are there gotchas? How much does Lightning Web Components play nicely with Aura?
Yes. Thank you, Zane. It plays really well. So Lightning Web Components can be placed inside of an Aura component. And as you saw there, we were able to pass properties into them. We were able to pass events between them. A Lightning Web Component cannot contain an Aura component, however. That is a limitation. That said, as you'll see in a few moments, we're also, however, able to communicate across sibling components. So as you saw in that last UI, we had components here which are both Aura and Lightning Web Components on the same page communicating in real time with each other.
And when you reference a Lightning Web Component from an Aura component, like if that's my parent component, do I as a developer even have to know whether or not it's an Aura component or a web component?
No, absolutely not. And so when you create Aura components, in fact, under the covers, we've been changing our own base components into Lightning Web Components for some time. And so you've actually been using Lightning Web Components for quite a while and not knowing it. And that's the level of seamless interoperability that we're talking about.
So it's really a both and. I can choose to build in Aura and I can choose to build in Lightning Web Components, and I don't have to worry about them not working together.
That's right.
That's great. And we saw several recipes using those base components that if you're used to, like Lightning Card I saw in there, or a Lightning Record Form, all of those base components, they're available for me as a developer, whether I'm using Aura or Lightning Web Components.
That's right.
That's great. So Kevin, Kevin 2, as we're calling Kevin in the middle here, I have a feeling you have a bit more to say about what's available and how I can discover that as a developer.
I do. Kevin, you did an amazing job highlighting the power and the breadth of Lightning Web Components in only a few minutes. But to some people, maybe that could be a little bit overwhelming. Like, where do I start? Oh my gosh, do I go to GitHub and just start reading the code and figure it all out? Some people might do that, but we've made an incredible investment in Component Library. It's a great tool online. I have the URL up in front of me here. As you can see, we have a great developer guide. We always invest a lot in documentation. And so I'm on the landing page for Introduction to Lightning Web Components, and you can see just a few links gets you kind of deep into learning some of the concepts that Kevin was talking about. One of the things that we've added here, though, is search, because I'm not very good at like clicking through all these links. I'd rather go search for a concept. As you've heard us talking a lot about events, let me go see what we have on events here in our library. I'm searching for that. It'll pop up here in a second, and you can see, I can go and learn how to do the creation and dispatch of events, and there's going to be a lot more guided tour here versus just the raw code that you would find on GitHub. And what's interesting here is we hit on it. Zane, you covered this. You said hey, we're investing more in standards, right? And so it's not just that we have taken the time to document this in our dev guide for you. It's that you'll see commonly, even at the bottom, we're going to have links to MDN, right? Which is amazing. If I want to go learn about custom events, I don't have to just rely on this Salesforce dev guide and this tool set. In fact, I can use this really common tool that everyone probably uses every day, Google search. And so let's go look for custom events and see what we find. And right at the top there, of course, you have the MDN link. I could click through to that, But the great thing is there's so many more resources. It's not just Salesforce resources. It's not just MDN. You can go get rich blogs. And I mean, if I scroll down here, actually, one of my favorite websites is Krupa.com. It's been around quite a while, and I can go and read a very detailed description of custom events and get an understanding. And that's not anything to do with Salesforce. So the fact that we've been investing more and more in standards just pays off for general development, right? You don't need to pay the costs. Like, I got to go find that specific developer guide for the specific release because we're investing in modern JavaScript. And so obviously we have the dev guide available on the component library, but if you go into the references for components, you're going to see that what you might expect to see. And Kevin kind of gave away my secret. I was a little sad about that. I was reeling for the big reveal. But if I go and look at these Aura components today, I'm going to pull up the breadcrumb and take a peek under the covers and just look at the code that's going on. You can actually see this is a custom element, right? So it is a Lightning Web Component today, even though in your code you're referencing an Aura component. And you've been using them for a long time and not necessarily had to know it. This really speaks to the interoperability, and we've been hitting hard on that. It's not just that we're shipping a new framework and it's its own thing. It works very, very well with the existing framework, and you were using it and you didn't know it. And this has been around for quite some time.
Kevin, before you move on from this screen, so you said that this is a custom element. So for developers that maybe aren't as comfortable in the dev tools or wondering what that means, what does that mean as you're here inspecting, say, the markup on the page? What does that custom element mean?
That's a very good question. And custom elements really are something that you've been using and browsers never exposed you before. Like if you've written a video tag, or a select list. Like, a lot of magic happens behind the scenes. Browsers have always done these things for us as web developers, but with Lightning Web Components, you get to make your own. You can make your own video element. You can make your own pick list, and then you can add rich functionality in there, and then it's simplified in this tag. Like the same magic you saw with the record edit form that Kevin was showing, you can actually go and make your own experiences there, and the interface that developers are going to use is a very simple declarative tag.
So it means also when I'm developing and I'm working, say, in VS Code or something that we may look at in a minute, what my markup I think is in my HTML file when I go inspect it in developer tools in Chrome or Firefox or somewhere else is going to look like what I developed. I'm not going to have a suddenly different tags showing up there.
That's right. We're getting out of div soup world, I think, is what a lot of old hat web developers might call it. And it's almost the promise of what you see is what you get under the covers too. That's a very good point. And since custom elements are a web standard, again, this is just something you can go search for and learn more about in MDN. We touch on it in our documents, and then we go in length at educating about how you can build those in Lightning Web Components. So if I go back here to my sample, I was just showing you how Aura components really are Lightning Web Components today under the hood. But let's take a peek at the equivalent Lightning Web Component for breadcrumbs. So here, as you can see, it's loading up some sample pages. This looks a little bit different. Let's get this going. As soon as I'm going to try a refresh.
Live demo.
Live demo. Thanks, Dave. So now I actually have this loaded up. You can see that I have the same breadcrumbs, but then down below, this is kind of cool.
Yeah, what is this?
So you can see the code that Kevin was showing before, like it kind of looks like it's here. So I could actually come in here and say, well, maybe it's cases. Maybe it should be plural. And I want to go make that quick change. I go hit run. Oh, it updates live. And the documentation is a great place to come and learn, and it's also a great place to come and play around with this a little bit. We have this link that you may have noticed up here, and it's called Open in Playground. So I can quickly go from this interactive doc page to something that looks maybe a little more familiar to developers, and I've got these 3 samples. So here's this base component I was just playing with. I could switch over and say, hey, I want to go learn about the next example, which is it has an on click, which now shows me, a card that would appear, and then I can go to the third example, which is showing me how I could use iterations. So if I want to look at what the template looks like for this, I can go and see like, oh, this is really cool. Look, the template is using the for each, and it's bound to the my breadcrumbs data object that's underneath in the JavaScript class, and is able to go render it.
So you can explore the syntax and see in real time what would it look like then in the UI as you're playing with it.
Yeah, again, it's a great place to come and learn and play and educate yourself about this framework. And we have lots of links that link off to the web, and you can go do your own searching. And so this is really a great education tool. But I think with this, we really want to get into like, how are we going to code this and get my code into an org, which I have a great friend here who can who can help us with that?
Who
It's Dave.
who would that be? Are we all looking at you, Dave?
Yes, I think we are. So yeah, I have a couple of demos, and I'm really excited about not only Lightning Web Components because it really does a couple of things for Salesforce developers. One, it gives you a world-class modern environment in which to create a user interface. But it also brings with it a lot of tooling improvements that we've added together with language server protocols and the custom extensions that we've created for VS Code. And so I'm going to demonstrate some of that right now. So here we are in VS Code. You might be thinking, well, that's great. I can download components from GitHub. I can play with them in the playground, but how do I create a component?
Yep.
So it's actually quite simple. In the coming release, you can use Visual Studio Code. So this is Visual Studio Code. If you've not seen it before, it's a free IDE, and we have built custom extensions to really improve the experience for Salesforce developers on the platform. And these basically surface using Command-Shift-P, and that brings up this command palette. So as you can see, I've got something selected here, which is Create Lightning Web Component, which is different from Create Lightning Component, because you can create those through the IDE as well. So the first thing it asks me is, where do I want to create my web component? I've created it in the LWC folder. And then it asks me the name of the component. So I enter foo, and it tells me it's running, and I can scroll up now into my LWC folder. There's my foo component. I've got the HTML template that we saw demonstrated before, as well as, so that's the template, it's empty, and the JS file. At this point, I can go ahead and code away, bring in other components, assemble my new component, whichever way I want, and then push it to either a Scratch org or to Sandbox or Dev Edition.
So by default, the CLI helps you by making 3 files for you out of the box.
Yep, these are essentially the minimum number of files that you need for a web component. So some other things around tooling that I think are pretty cool. I'm going to show this, by the way, all the code in here is from the
Recipes.
From the recipes,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
I keep wanting to call it samples. From the recipes.
Sample recipes.
And this recipe basically uses a library to get a record. It sits on a record homepage, and it's quite simple. It just shows a few names and displays them. But what I want to show is, we talked about this import over here initially, and this is importing from the LWC runtime. And again, as Kevin mentioned, we have this other import, and this is importing from a module that is within the project, and it's called Record UI Record API. And you can see just by hovering over this, it tells me a little bit about the module, which is fantastic. But more importantly, when I hover over the actual method that I'm exporting from that or importing from that module, I can see all the parameters. A required record ID, anything that is a parameter with a question mark after it is optional. And so I can quickly see everything that I need to do or need to provide to be able to use this component. But what I really like is that we've embedded direct links to the documentation for that particular API library. And so you can drill into that really quickly and get directly to the more detail if you need it. So let's take a look at another aspect. This again is another component from the recipes. This one basically does a search for contacts. And this one is more akin to the one that Kevin showed, in that we're doing an import of find contacts. That's a method that's defined in our contact controller. Right? This is an Apex class with find contacts and possibly some other things. We'll get to that in a minute. But like the previous example, if I hover over this, now I see what the ins and outs defined in the Apex method are. You can see that I need to provide it a search key, and then I get some data returned. So let's take a look at the controller real quick. So here's my find contacts method. And it's pretty straightforward, but what I want to do is I want to make this a little bit more flexible. So I want to be able to provide my own limit on the number of records coming back. So the way I'm going to do that is just to find another parameter. We'll call it max. And then I would use that parameter down here in my SOCL statement. All right, and so you'll notice that Apex has gotten better and better code completion and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and go back to my component. Now, what Visual Studio Code does is it provides this local analysis of all the code in your project, right? So what that means is if I hover over Find Contacts now, you'll see my new parameter is right there. I haven't pushed it up to the server or done anything like that, but we're now very aware of all the dependencies and all the references. I think referential integrity is a term that we haven't mentioned. And so beyond that, I can go ahead where Find Contacts is invoked, for instance. If I get to the end of that string and I start typing, I get something called max. And then I can add a value to that. So, oops, sorry, proper syntax. So that
Dave being awesome. Is that
Exactly. Yeah.
that shows like the advances, what people expect from modern programming environments. One final thing that I forgot to show over here that I'd like to show is like, what if I don't know? I'm curious as to what else might be in this module that I imported. Well, there's a great thing that you can do is hit Control Space, and now I see all the other methods that live within that particular API. So if I wanted to, I could go get the record UI, for instance. And so there's just the accessibility, the hinting, the autocomplete, the IntelliSense really makes this a fantastic experience.
And how do we get those extensions, Dave? And where do you go to install them?
Well, very simply, these extensions are on the Visual Studio Code Marketplace, which is where many extensions for various things live. But it's all free. Visual Studio Code is free. The extensions are free. Highly recommend using it.
Great. And you search for Salesforce extensions, and you should find a whole pack of things bundled together?
Yep, search for Salesforce DS. So we've got a lot of extensions, but we also have collected them all together in something called an extension pack. Now, the LWC extension is available right now. For the CLI to use, for you to be able to use this with the CLI, which is driving Visual Studio Code, you either need the pre-release version of the toolkit or wait till we're fully GA.
Awesome. And we have more resources about how you can make sure you're on the right release and hook up with all of these resources and get hands-on. So Dave, is Visual Studio Code the only way that we can develop Lightning Web Components?
Visual Studio Code is not the only way. As I mentioned, it's being driven by the CLI, and so a lot of our tooling partners are leveraging the CLI to be able to create these components and provide that developer experience. We are in the process of modernizing our entire developer experience, and that means the things inside the UI. And so forward-looking statements, we will be able to give you that experience within the UI.
Awesome. So we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and I have some more questions just in general for the panel. And we had a question coming in from Twitter. Darren Dowell asks, I think one of Kevin's, are there any tips or a primer on how to catch up and learn ES6, this modern JavaScript programming? If you're a Salesforce developer, how do you catch up and learn? Where should you go?
I think it's a great question. I'll take that, Kevin. If you noticed in the documentation, even we had a link. We've published a Trailhead online, just an introduction to ES6 JavaScript, which is a great place to start. MDN is also a wonderful place to start. But again, it comes down to this Google search. Like, you can go search for ES6, and you're going to find a plethora of resources. Pluralsight has some really great courses, and it's almost endless where you can start. But we've also created the Trailhead, which gives a very good overview of the general concepts. And that's probably the place I'd recommend to go and start. It's very concise, and it's not too much information, and it gives you a lot of the general concepts, and then you can go deeper and deeper from there.
And MDN is the Mozilla
Developer Network, yeah.
Right? Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a great thing I'd say with that as well is, as you're learning, return back to the recipes sample set of components, because it's a great way to go and then exercise a little bit of that new information that you've learned. Go and actually try it out on the components, see how we are using standard ES6 syntax and so forth to achieve those things that the components do.
Yeah, David highlighted the min files was 3, but there was only actually 1 file type missing, the CSS file, which is amazing because Aura you need 8, here you need 3, so.
Yeah. I mean, and you can add CSS and you can add other JavaScript files to your components. So that's just kind of the minimal stuff to get started.
Yeah.
It's very flexible.
It is flexible, but I also love, as a developer who was used to writing Aura components, and then when I stepped into this new model, I really love the power of the fact that we're gathering so much together in that metadata file. The fact that it is the Lightning component bundle definition there, and then I define what Lightning app pages I want to put it on. I can have different configurations for different pages, and all of that information about my component is living in one place now, and I think that's incredible.
It's almost like a manifest.
Right? Was that almost a package XML joke?
Just a little.
Well, manifests are used quite commonly in other types of applications, React and Vue.
It's our destiny.
So we've talked a lot about the in-app tooling that you get and the efficiency. What about testing? What about testing Lightning Web Components?
Yeah, I'll take that if you like. So we've shipped along with Lightning Web Components a fantastic testing tool. So we provide, as part of the extensions, actually it sets up for your environment in your project and means to go and do unit testing. And that's sort of something new that we've done with our UI development. And what that really means is, in this case, we're building on top of Jest, which is a fantastic testing tool released by Facebook. It's really popular in the industry. It allows you to do unit tests, meaning that you can go and write very targeted tests at a particular component, and it doesn't require necessarily spinning up an org and running it against the actual UI. You run it just against a component locally on your own machine. And because of that, we then allow you to do things like in IDE development and debugging. So you can run Jest, for example, in what we call watch mode. And if you look at the recipes repository, we walk through how to do that. But it basically lets you step through line by line and see how your component's behaving. And you can write tests sort of as you go in the traditional test-driven development style.
That's awesome. Shout out TDD. So on Twitter, I'm hearing shouts out to a lot of the things that we've been showing. So Squire Kirshner says, Dave is making it too easy to develop. Are you telling me I don't have to hunt and peck for every function parameter or bit of documentation while using VS Code? My stress level is plummeting. So I think people like IntelliSense, Dave.
You'll have to brag to your grandchildren that you didn't have to walk uphill both ways to school, I guess.
We've heard this from internal developers too, that we're just starting with a tool set, and some have even said I didn't feel like I needed to jump into the documentation because of this. So there's so much information there, but it's generally one click away or right at your fingertips.
And it's focused. As we talked about, it's a lot to absorb at once, but as you're working, you can get what you need as you need it, sort of step by step.
I actually learned about the command space just now, so thanks for that. I'm going to be more productive.
Fantastic.
So along with testing, is there a test code coverage requirement with Lightning Web Components? K2?
We actually don't enforce test code coverage requirement, but the Jest tools do help you understand your test code coverage, and since we all strive for 100%, I think 100% of your code you cover and test, right, Kevin?
Well, there's many views on it. We recommend a high amount of coverage. You just want to, more than anything, produce high quality code. And on that front as well, Jest actually allows you to do code coverage generation for it and do that analysis for you. And so we're planning a blog post, I think mid-February offhand, where we're going to be offering a lot of more targeted guidance about best practices and patterns around testing it. You'll start to see rolling into all the repositories as well, a great deal more test code there as well for people to learn from.
I think even in recipes, we have tests for almost all the recipes now, or really close.
Yep, as well as the eBucks repository.
Right.
One other thing about the testing that I think is important to keep in mind is as we're enabling this great developer experience, part of that is your integration and deployment, your CI and your CD. And of course, with the scripting available, running your Lightning Web Component tests alongside your Apex tests is going to be the way to go, and completely set up for that. There's no additional things you need to do to enable that.
So Dave, can you talk to us more about developing against any org? Because I'm seeing some questions coming in about, so where can we use Lightning Web Components and how do we get these components into sandboxes?
Okay, so you can use Lightning Web Components in any Spring 19 org. Okay, so that's number one. And if you're in pre-release, then you're good to go. You can, obviously, maybe not obviously, I think the way to go is to build out in a scratch org. But with the new commands available through the CLI, you can deploy these very easily to Sandbox or Developer Edition, just using the source deploy and source retrieve commands. So there's really nothing about Lightning Web Components from a deployment scenario that is any different than any other metadata.
And you have to deploy everything at once?
Of course not.
Yeah.
So you can pick and choose and move it. And once it's in a sandbox, we can also bundle Lightning Web Components in change sets, right? So we have a lot of flexibility there.
Yep. Yeah.
Which is great. So I'm seeing another question coming in about can we use Lightning Web Components off of Salesforce?
Go ahead.
Well, currently, you can develop an LWC off of Salesforce, but obviously there's some notions around our decorators that you're using that really are designed to work within Salesforce for data access. It's not something that's supported as a first-class citizen right now, but if you think about the future and where we would like to go, it's really getting closer and closer to developing, off of Salesforce with the framework. A lot of what we had for inspiration were we looked at a lot of existing frameworks that are already out there and kind of modeled and kind of chose how to shape ourselves. But this current release is really focused with developing on Salesforce platform, and a lot of the things you're seeing in the power of the decorators here are really designed to work on Salesforce. But there's nothing really stopping from developing off of Salesforce if you don't want to use those notions.
Isn't the fact that we're using standards in the evolving specifications, especially around decorators and the at-wire adapters, which is basically your interface between the UI and the data on the back end, that I think puts us in a good place to be able to use this in different places. You just figure out how to build that other adapter, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. The standards investment was key for us because really wanted to get out of the specific notions of you have to always be on Salesforce to use this technology. And as you mentioned, we're actually part of TC39, and we go and meet regularly, and we've been really pushing the decorator spec forward. Another point is we just recently signed the papers to join W3C, so we're going to be participating more and more in standards and help driving. It's not that we're waiting for these things to happen. We're actually trying to influence, and we're using all of these enterprise scenarios that are coming out of Salesforce to help the web move forward.
So we're part of that larger conversation about how the web is being built, actually. So that goes to another question that we're getting. So as a Salesforce developer whom I remembered thinking, okay, now I need to learn this new model when we rolled out Aura components. Why should Salesforce developers be excited that we're giving them another programming model? What is exciting about this? Okay.
Yeah, certainly. For me as a developer, I think the biggest thing is that it's just a bunch of standards. It's no longer proprietary, which means then not only can I bring all the existing knowledge that I have perhaps from past experience to this, but it also allows me to invest in my own career. So as I learn new capabilities that are aligned with standards, I can then go and take that elsewhere and apply that knowledge and that expertise elsewhere. So for me, that's really quite valuable as a developer. It then also allows me to bring sort of my own tools. So we mentioned as VS Code not being the only development tool. At times you can spin up Vim, Emacs, whatever editor you like. And again, it's just standard JavaScript and modern JavaScript, modern HTML, etc. So all modern editors support that stuff out of box. So you don't need any special plugins per se to sort of get going and get a lot of the capability out of the box.
So you're going to get going faster, you're going to be able to find your answers sooner, and these are potentially long-term skills.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what impact have you seen? We talked a little bit about the fact that under the hood, we've been converting base components to Lightning Web Components. What impact have we seen internally from this journey ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted. One aspect is we've been, as you mentioned, doing this internally on our base components, which means the Lightning experience itself has become remarkably faster over time, and a large part of that is because of our investment in Lightning Web Components. The other aspect is just sort of like the groundswell that we're seeing internally of developers being excited to write in Lightning Web Components, as they, again, as I mentioned, so use their existing expertise and bring it to it. They're that much faster, more productive, and enjoy development in general.
Any speed bumps that you wish you could do differently? Kevin Hill?
Well, it's a good question. I think we've been developing on this actually for years, and we've shown you under the hood that you've been using this for a long time as well, and we've had a lot of learnings from internal teams. I don't think there's, like, to answer specifically, I don't think doing anything differently, the answer is always we'd love to have more time before we take it, except these are standards, and so they're going to evolve, and we're going to be there with them, right? And we're going to be driving them as we spoke to. So it's that we're just going to stay involved and keep kind of pushing and driving these things forward, and not waiting for them to happen. If you kind of rewind, you think about when Aura hit, it was really developed around a similar time as like jQuery, and it was really cutting edge for components. It was one of the first frameworks that really took and embraced components from the get-go.
Yeah.
And this is saying, like, well, the web's kind of getting there now with the way that custom elements are shaping up for components, and aligning with that is really the way to go. But I wouldn't say there's like a bunch of things that we would have liked to have changed with this release, because we're actually quite proud of the fact inside of Salesforce we've been moving along and building on it as it's being developed. So by the time it's here, like, people are using a very mature product.
Right. We've been using it. You've been using it. We know that it holds water. Or champagne.
Champagne. Toast.
So I'm seeing some questions coming in that I think are going to need one of us to maybe get hands-on again and show something on our computer. So K1, I'm going to flip this to you first. Can you show us a little bit about how Lightning Web Components are tested if they aren't Apex? Can you maybe call up a test and show us what that looks like?
Certainly. Yeah, so let's take a look at one of these test files.
Watch mode working.
So let's take a look at hello binding. So we were looking before, if you recall, that component, and just to bring it up again, just to refresh our memories, this hello binding component, right? So as I type, it changes dynamically.
Right.
And so in this particular test, let me first show the structure of it. So over here on the left-hand side, we've got our component structure. We looked previously at the HTML and JavaScript. There's a corresponding XML file for the metadata. But we also have this _test, and that's a standard jest artifact and sort of standard structure that a lot of test frameworks use. And then we've got here our hello binding test. And so it itself is our test file. It's the unit test. And so, and quickly walk us through it. So we're basically at this point, again, import statements. We're importing that standard component we're going to test. And then we go through a number of test scenarios. So describe allows us to effectively structure and organize our tests. So after each test in particular, we're going to do a bit of cleanup work in the DOM. But more importantly, let's take a look at an actual test we're running. So in this case, sort of written in natural language, that component, it displays greeting specified change by change event target. Sorry. So our expected value is test. What we do is we go ahead and we create the element, we add it into our DOM, and then we go ahead and verify that, one, we go and select the element, and then two, we verify that it doesn't say our expected thing yet. So we basically want to assert, are we in a state where we haven't applied the value yet?
Right.
We trigger the new greeting, so we go and we find the input element. And the thing about this is, I'll just touch on is, this again is all just sort of standard, so there's nothing proprietary here. We're doing a standard query selector. So we go and select the actual HTML element, we assign it into our value, which is our binding value, or our hello binding component. So our Lightning in component, which is composed inside of our binding, and then we dispatch a change. So as our component was authored, we listen to the change event and then respond to it. So we're simulating the user doing that. We then wait for a render cycle, and then we go and test, has the component actually now been updated to that? And so you see a lot of the language, a lot of the APIs here used are quite standard and straightforward. We've got this, expect something not to be this value, or expect it to be this value.
That's great. And that for those that are comfortable with Apex testing, this should feel very familiar, that I can do negative asserts, I can do positive asserts, we can wait for a certain action to complete and then assert afterwards. So, and it is very human readable here, which I think is one of the nicest thing about the tests. Yeah. So then you could run this locally and we would get information about how the test is running.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will go ahead and do that for us now, actually. So we've got this project already set up to do so. And we can just run I think offhand.
And right there, this command you're executing, npm run test unit, that's not there's no Salesforce run my tests here. We're talking standards here. Now you're interacting directly with Jest framework to test your web component code.
Exactly. So what we've bundled is a command called lbc jest. And so it uses Jest under the covers and just applies the right configuration, so to set things up to look in the right places for you out of the box, so it just works for Lightning Web Components. You, of course, don't have to use it. Again, we're just using standard tools here, sort of best industry practices. So if you'd like to configure it, you can definitely do so as you like if you're a power user or power developer. If not, you can sort of use our defaults out of the box And so you can see here, to Dave's point before, I haven't pushed my Scratch org. I'm not running this on the server. I'm actually running this all locally. So if I'm on a train or a plane or wherever, I'm able to do this development and testing locally. But two, I can validate this stuff locally and iterate pretty quickly. Beyond that, I had touched on just offers what's called a watch mode, which is great for TDD. So you effectively tell Jess that you'd like it to watch your file system for changes.
Yeah.
So as I go and make changes to my component, it will, for example, go and run new tests. So for example, if I was to flip one of these a search just as a quick test, so this test should now fail, and I save the file, simply by saving it, it reruns actually just a subset of the test and is going to go ahead and tell me there's a failure, and then we get some great message. It expected hello test, but it got hello world.
And that's, as you're developing then this very granular ability to run, I'm working on this particular piece of my test suite. I don't have to then even go in and issue a command to say, please only run this test. That's really, really awesome.
Yep.
And I think we didn't look at it yet, but there's built-in debugging capability in VS Code, and that also extends to your tests as well. You can debug your tests, right?
Exactly, and for me, that's invaluable. The ability to use VS Codes or really any IDE that supports that type of integration to go ahead and do that. So you can set breakpoints, step into it. It'll give you sort of stacks, the call frames, and so forth.
That's great. So we have another one that would require hands-on demoing, so I can open it up to the panel. But we're getting questions about what was going on with that cacheable equals true annotation. What does that actually do? Can we show people the benefit of that?
Sure, and I can go ahead and load up that controller. I'll take a quick peek at that. So this is the code that Dave had showed earlier where we looked at that find contacts, and Dave had added an additional parameter. But I think the question specifically is around this cacheable true.
Yes.
So what this is doing is it's basically telling our system to allow the client to do some caching. And what that really means then is when you have multiple components using this Apex class, using this Apex method, the client can start doing a lot of smart caching for you. So if you make the same calls many times over, we'll cache it on the client so there's no network trip. And what that means really is it's remarkably faster for your end user.
So as a developer, I don't have to manage this. I just add that annotation and then magic.
In many regards, yes. Yep, and so some some constraints that cacheable implies, one of which is the operations that you're doing, the logic inside of your method is read-only. It has to be what's called memoizable, which means we can cache on the client. We don't have to invoke it every time.
So you're not doing database.save down there, so we're just querying.
Yep. And of course, we have the constraints and the checks in there, so if you do try that while you're developing, you'll get an error out of it, and it will tell you basically what's going wrong so you can go and correct it.
That's great. I do love in-app error messages. Better that we get it at development time, I think we say, than the users getting it at runtime. So we have another question coming in. Going forward, when you're building the new Lightning components, should we build using the Web Component Framework and stop using Aura?
That's a great question. I think, Salesforce is one of the biggest investor in Lightning components. Like, we've been building components for years, obviously, and it's not that there's a goal to overnight rip out every single Aura component. And so we have to be pragmatic about how we would go develop forward. And really, you want to think about it in kind of what's the right kind of chunk of component you want to go build. It's not like you want to go replace everything at the sub level. Like, we offer you a lot of base components you should use for that. But if you think about you've got maybe a Kanban board and a card inside of that. Well, if you want to, maybe you might be having some perf issues with the way you designed it, dragging things around might be a little sluggish. You could go redesign that card in LWC, and the Lego block fits right into Aura, and you'll already see some kind of improvements and benefits without having to go and undo any of the other existing investments you have for various reasons. And we're taking the same approach too. It's not like we have every single component just being rewritten over time. That's a very hard task to take on. Aura is still going to be around. We're still going to be using it in Salesforce. But if we're choosing to do a new component, we're choosing to start writing this new component in LWC for certain. There's no real danger in that. The interop is there. We've really worked hard to make sure that it's interoperable with the existing components on page.
So that it really is this both and that by use case you can go start exploring it as a web component and then extend it out into Aura if you find that you need to.
For certain, yes.
Yep. So we have another question about how are we handling that field validation in that form that we saw with the JavaScript in Lightning Web Components? How are we handling that?
Sure. So that component's using the metadata based off the field. So the type of the field, for example, whether it's a number, whether it's an email address in that particular case, max number of digits, for example, on numbers that you can specify, it uses the metadata to derive that.
So it's looking at what the platform knows about that field, and then it's surfacing those errors back to the users.
That's right.
How are they doing that? Can you show us that in the code? What does that look like?
From a developer perspective, there's actually nothing that you have to do.
Yeah,
So,
I think that your validation rules, some of these limits on field length, these are done at schema development time, not at application development time. And that's what we mean by reflecting the metadata about those objects.
Yeah. So you're going to show us, so right here, we're seeing our Lightning record form.
And so, as I mentioned before, we're specifying the fields, but that's it. As a developer, I don't actually have to go and re-specify those constraints. It's defined in the schema, and the component enforces it.
So there's no big chunk of JavaScript saying, if this, then error in the user's face.
That's right.
This is coming from the schema. That's
Absolutely.
incredible.
Now, that said, if you desire that level of customization as a developer, we give you the hooks to do so. And so we treat this as a standard form, much like a standard HTML form. So we have things like the onSubmit event. So you can listen to that event, inspect basically what are the field values, and then go and do transformations, additional validation if you like, proceed to do the submit of the form to the server, or you can stop and display your own custom messages if you like. But out of the box, it's just based off the metadata.
And if you want to know what events are being driven off this Lightning record form, of course, as we saw, you can get right there from the developer guide. And Dave showed us in the IDE some of the ways you can do that in your JavaScript controller to extend this customization. So we have another question. So Kevin, I think you asked it on one side once again, but we want to know in the audience, what about testing, and is the 75% requirement for Apex, is it still in place? And how is Web Components affecting this?
So the 75% is for deploying Apex, number one. You don't need any testing while you're in your sandbox, but if you ever want to get it to production, you'll need that test coverage and for packaging. But there is no restriction like that on Lightning Web Components. It's good practice. We hope you've enjoyed the fact that you've built great code because you've adhered to test coverage, but it's not required.
But to be truthful, there's no requirement there, but we've also seen that developers actually enjoy writing these tests a lot more. So even for some internal component development, people are like, we got a lot of test coverage, and it was really easy to go do and add these tests and repeat them. So the task is a lot lighter, and that's a nice thing. But yeah, there is no hard requirement for Lightning Web Components.
It's up to you to do the right thing, essentially, as a developer. No pressure.
Best practice.
Yeah. So we're getting some questions in about this, how we're affecting web standards and how we're interacting with the larger industry. And so what does this mean? How is Salesforce actually influencing the industry? Maybe Kevin.
So yeah, part of influencing the industry is showing up for the discussions that happen. There's these bodies out there, TC39, WG, and the W3C, and all these sort of standards bodies have discussions. The great thing is, in a lot of cases, you can go onto GitHub yourself and look at these specs and see us contributing. You will see handles from Salesforce talking about issues on GitHub for the new standards that matter. We really watch what's going on in the standards, and we want to make sure that enterprise scenarios get in there. Browser vendors will kind of drive for the greater good of the web, and Salesforce has been a great voice to help them kind of understand these scenarios and get them in there. But it's really the participation piece that's key, and the constant participation. We even host TC39, I think, once a year, twice a year, I forget, but we're
looking to start to do that, I think, this year, 2019.
But I think we did host once, or maybe this, but we're hosting TC39 at Salesforce, and like I said, we just joined W3C, so we'll be involved in some of the other events coming up, like TPAC, and having those conversations. We have a lot of people on the team who also just know a lot of the folks that build browsers, and so we just have constant conversations. We try and do this as much in the open and as we can, so that other people can see them. Anyone can go create issues on these specs. You don't have to be a member. So if you want to help influence, and maybe you see that we're not taking your full scenario, you can come and just put an issue on GitHub on these specs. And
That's
so,
right.
so really, that's one of the ways that we're influencing. We have a lot of people on the team that are very passionate about doing this. Carity and Diego are a couple of the other architects that aren't here, and they're very involved. And you will see their GitHub handles in a lot of these conversations.
So we're planning out in the open, but we're also bringing what we're learning in the Salesforce world and helping influence the direction of the tools you're going to use, where our code is running in the browser, and how the web is serving it up itself. Is that really what we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the things that we have done in the past and we're doing now are good ideas for us, but they're good ideas for everyone also, right? And so if you think about a lot of the browser security issues that Salesforce has tried to tackle, because trust is our number one value, and we have to really serve our customers. There's no reason why those security issues shouldn't be applied across the entire web when you're building web apps. And so these are things that we can contribute back and help drive.
And I think one thing that I'm really excited about, along with the playground and some of these other resources, is the way that you can even explore that exact kind of security context. If I'm bringing in a third-party library and I want to know if it's going to play well, we're exposing the ability to test those different contexts right there in the component library. And that's part of this being more open, making sure that it's flexible and works for every developer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let me take a second just to plug the Locker API viewer. So in this, it goes and enumerates basically the browser APIs and what the Lightning Locker service is doing on top of it, whether there's parity, whether it's a complete pass-through, or whether there is filtering, so that we can ultimately, at the end of it, have components authored by multiple organizations run on the same page in the same DOM, operate safely and securely. And so there's great information here in that Locker API tab, but also in the Locker console.
That's great. And so this Locker console here, as a developer, you could, what are we testing here? What can you use this for?
Yeah, so you can drop code in and then toggle basically different aspects of how Locker service operates and run your code here sort of on the fly, do a bit of exploration, sort of like the playground, but in this case in the context of Locker, to understand what's going to work, what's not going to work.
That's incredible. And this is available, as you can see right here on the Salesforce developer site. So you can go in as you're writing your code, play with it here, and then bring it back over to your IDE once you're satisfied.
Yep, right, one click away from Playground, Developer Guide, and Component Reference.
So we have another couple of questions that are coming in. How competitive is this? We're talking about performance. How competitive is the performance of Lightning Web Components with, say, a Vue or a React?
That's a great question. It's one of my favorite questions I get asked every day. I mean, there's a few different ways we look at performance. One of the benchmarks we've been using is this JavaScript benchmark that looks at, I think that's actually just what it's called, the JavaScript benchmark, micro benchmark that sort of looks at data table type scenarios. And if you go and run that on the current release version, it's a very competitive framework with Vue and Angular and React. The numbers look the same in a lot of areas. Some places were better, some a little off, but it's all very competitive as a raw framework. If you're just looking at the power to go and like do something kind of semi-complicated like a data table. But to answer the question like more completely, like it's not just about that micro benchmark. That's sort of the framework on its own. If you want to go build a website on it, great, you could go do it. It's going to be competitive. When it comes into Salesforce, we're adding in a lot of things like Locker and the enterprise security layer and these sorts of things. And we get a huge speed boost within Salesforce for this, right? And so we also watch, like if you're loading a record homepage, like how does that look with just Lightning components compared to Lightning Web components, right? And so we can see that we're getting a lot of speed boost just on the Salesforce platform as well. And so we really look at it holistically. If it's standing on its own and you want to compare it, you can go and run these JS benchmark tests and see for yourself. Like again, it's in the open. It's available for you to go do. That it's a very competitive framework with React, Vue, and Angular.
And we have another follow-up question. So what about the performance numbers? And are we going to be sharing performance numbers about Web Components versus Aura and what that performance looks like?
I think the goal is to share more of these in the open. We don't have anything yet that automatically publishes performance numbers out. Yeah. We talked in the launch event earlier this week, that we see in a lot of the scenarios that there's a 6x improvement for runtime.
Yeah.
Which is obviously one of the reasons we wanted to go and invest is everyone loves it when web pages load faster and the fan doesn't kick on, right? So those are things that we're seeing. But my goal, kind of from the product side, is to make sure every time we go release the engine, we're actually proactively publishing these numbers and getting them in front of people. So it is a goal to have that out there.
Yeah, if I could, I just want to emphasize that though we look at it internally an incredible amount, literally on every check into the engine, we run these benchmarks ourselves and monitor this. But we also have to consider it in the aggregate, and that is, it's not just that the LWC engine is fast and remarkably faster than the OR engine, but it's also, are we doing the things like caching data and metadata correctly and efficiently? Because at the end of the day, when your user's using the application, it's not just one part of that, it's all of those things coming together that make for either a fast experience or a slow experience.
Yep. So we're getting some questions about what's next. So one question coming in is, we have the ability to deploy to any org. What's next coming, Dave, in the CLI and in the future of getting something that works for any org? I'm trying to parse what the question said. I think it's, what's next with the CLI? We can work against any org with those commands. Anything else?
Yeah, there's related to that. So basically, we're talking about the difference between source development, source-based development, and org-based development. When we talk about source-based development, we're talking about scratch orgs and keeping the source in sync between the local machine and up at the server level. And org-based development is more of your traditional kind of Eclipse-y type development. Mm-hmm. And so related to that, are the introduction of a couple of new commands that are currently in beta, source deploy and source retrieve. We're enhancing those commands such that they have all the bells and whistles that MD API deploy had, things like rollback on error, check only, that kind of thing. In addition to that, we're enhancing our convert commands so that they're more selective. Right now, the convert command just takes all your source and converts it either to metadata API or the other way to source format. Mm-hmm. And so we're providing the ability to pick a file, pick a folder, pick a metadata type, whatever it is that you want to convert so that you can better manage your source. Longer term, we're looking to add more things around automation, customization of the CLI in terms of pre and post execution hooks. The idea is that you would register your plugin to listen for some other plugins execution and be able to do something just prior or just after the execution of that other plugin or command. So we're also looking at making discoverability of custom plugins easier, right? Mm-hmm. So that from within the CLI you can search for other custom plugins that you might want to take advantage of.
And there's another question here of, sorry, I should get my glasses on. So plugins are coming and all of this is great, but what is really next for using Source? Does everyone need to migrate to Source today?
That's a good question and one that's come up a lot. And we're taking an approach with the CLI to default everything to what we call source format. And I think there's quite a bit of misunderstanding of what it means, what source format means. Source format does not change the format of the contents of any of your files. What it does is it decomposes certain metadata types so that they're much more granularly trackable in your source code.
Do you want to show us that, since you have an IDE right in front of you, that you can maybe show us what that means?
Yeah, let me see if I've got, I don't know if I've got objects in here. Are there any yeah, okay, yeah, so within the IDE you can see that I've got an object called contact. This is a standard object. Mm-hmm. Now in the traditional format, that would be one giant XML file. Yeah. And within that XML file are some top-level XML elements. One is all the fields, right? One is the list views, and then there's others. And so what happens is when you change maybe a label on one of your fields, in your source code control, it looks like the object has changed.
Yes.
Right? Not necessarily the level of detail. Sure, you could do a compare and then you'd very quickly see where it was. But that doesn't really give you the kind of granularity you want. And so what we've done is we've taken the XML out of that object and created a new folder called Fields, which is actually the XML tag for a field within the old object, and created files that represent these. And so now when one of these labels change, I see a very discrete change within that field object. Likewise, static resources. Static resources can be a single file, maybe a CSS or a JavaScript file, or they can be an archive. And the archive is essentially a virtual file system, right, that's contained within one file. And so if we didn't decompose these, any change that you made to a slight CSS tweak and whatever's in your static resource would show the whole resource is being changed, and you'd likely not be able to understand that change because it is a binary zip file. And so we explode that out so that any changes that you make, you check in the exploded version into your source code control. Now, there's really no risk to deciding to convert everything to source code control. I think that the only reason why you wouldn't go to source format, is if in some process, and I know we have customers that do this, that's fine, if in some automated process you actually go in and edit XML files automatically. But otherwise, there's no new kind of code format to learn, right?
You're not changing anything about your org, just how you're interacting with the metadata on your local file system.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, that old format should be considered kind of our wire format, because all your source does get converted back to that before we push or deploy. And so now you can just kind of ignore that and think of it as a wire format.
That's great. So we have one question coming in from the Trailblazer community. At this point in time, can you develop Lightning Web Components in the developer console for Salesforce?
No, you cannot. So the developer console, it's kind of, I don't have the right analogy in my mind, but it's like, getting this shiny new thing and going and sticking it in like your crusty old barn to work on it, rather than have a nice modern garage. It's not available in Dev Console. You need to use either the CLI to create these in any editor that you want to begin encoding them, or use VS Code to create and code them. Looking forward, we want to take our crusty old barn and give it a facelift, and so that's one of the things that's on our roadmap, is to make our in UI editing much more consistent, modern, and on a par with Visual Studio Code.
And give you that efficiency that you want in the developer console when you're developing in these new ways.
Right. You saw all the benefits of the language server protocols. We don't have any of that in Dev Console. We're going to replace it with something that does have all that goodness.
That's great. So I think we have a few slides here to take us out home. So Kevin, if you don't mind to bring those back up. So we talked about how Lightning Web Components and Aura Components work together. We've looked at your questions. And now if you want to get hands-on and you want to learn more, which of course you do, we've made a trail mix consolidating a whole bunch of resources. Some of the things we talked about, getting started with JavaScript, getting started with Lightning Web Components, as well as interesting things from the Spring 19 docs. It's all there in this trail mix that we created just for this Release Readiness live broadcast. So please go check it out. And of course, next week, big news, I think, for all of us at this table, is it's our Global Developer Week. We're going around the world to talk directly to different developer groups about Lightning Web Components. And there, of course, you're going to get hands-on. We also have, I think, some cool swag somewhere here, over maybe over by Dave. In fact, Cody's going worldwide. So find your local developer group week here at that short link and make sure to join in. And I think Kevin 1, Kevin 2, are you hitting the road?
Kevin is going to help us out here locally in San Francisco. So if you're here, I myself am going to be going to Brisbane and Sydney for those community events. And Dave, are you on the road, or?
Have we gotten you out yet?
Nope.
It's better to keep Dave at a keyboard, making sure that he gets all these wonderful features in.
Yeah, Kevin and I will be teaming up together in San Francisco next week. So everyone should come. Fly into San Francisco and join us there. That'll be great.
Sydney's a little longer.
Slightly longer, yeah. And we have people going all over the world. I think we have over 150 groups registered. So it's a great time to connect with other local developers in your community. And again, there'll be lots of hands-on activities. There's going to be swag, and it's a really, really great time to just dive into this new way of working and be excited about what's coming in spring with Lightning Web Components. And with that, I think we are wrapping up time. It's been great to be here with you all, and we hope that you enjoy the Spring 19 release and Lightning Web Components. And thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Zane, for hosting.
Yeah.